Descartes, as we saw, is trying to demolish his belief system, so to speak, in order to build it back up again. And we have now seen or witnessed the demolition project. The bulldozer, so to speak, is the deceiving God hypothesis. The deceiving God hypothesis eliminates all of our beliefs, or at least every belief that could possibly be doubted. And so anything that the deceiving God hypothesis does not call into doubt is indubitable, is certain, and so can function as a foundation for human knowledge. But you might be thinking, the deceiving God hypothesis seemed so extreme. It called into doubt even like 2 plus 2 equals 4, that there's nothing that could possibly escape it without being doubted. Descartes thinks there is. And in the second meditation, he gives an argument that there's at least one belief that escapes the deceiving God hypothesis. That is to say, there's at least one belief that the deceiving God hypothesis does not call into doubt. And this is one of Descartes' most famous ideas. You see it inscribed on the bottom of that statue, Cogito ergo sum. What we're going to talk about in this video is what I'm going to call the cogito. The cogito. I don't know if it's a hard or a soft G. I don't know Latin. This is a shorthand way of referring to this argument. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of Cartesian coordinates, right? The XY plane. Many of you have probably heard this idea too. I think, therefore I am. This comes from Descartes. Although there's actually some evidence that Descartes just lifting it from St. Augustine, but whatever, we're not going to go into that. Descartes famous for it. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So when I refer to the cogito or the cogito, I'm just referring to this argument. I think, therefore I am, how it's working, what's going on here. Descartes thinks that with this idea, with the cogito, we find a belief that escapes the deceiving God hypothesis. So let's read it through really quickly, and then we'll kind of talk about it. I'll illustrate it. We'll come to understand it better. Now that I have convinced myself that there is nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies, right? And so what he's talking about here is the deceiving God hypothesis, right? These skeptical hypotheses. When we consider these skeptical hypotheses, we're convincing ourselves, so to speak, that none of this stuff is real, that the sky is not actually there. I might just be dreaming it, or there might be a deceiving God putting that idea in my head, that the earth isn't actually there. Again, same idea, that there might not be bodies out there. My body might not be real. It's just a deception, right? I've convinced myself that there's nothing in the world. Okay. Does it follow that I don't exist either? No, it does not follow. For if I convinced myself of something, well, then I certainly existed. But wait a minute. There's a supremely powerful and cunning deceiver, this deceiving God, who deliberately deceives me all the time. Even then, if he's deceiving me, I undoubtedly exist. Let him deceive me all he can. He can never bring it about that I am nothing while I think I am something. So after thoroughly thinking the matter through, I conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, must be true whenever I assert it or think it. That's how Descartes begins building back up the edifice of human knowledge. It's with this cogito argument. The basic idea is something like this. If there is thinking going on, even if that thinking comes in the form of doubting, right? Doubting things. If there is thinking going on, there must be some subject that is doing the thinking. And so if there is this thinking going on, if I am doubting whether or not I exist, say, well, then I, the subject, have to exist in order for that thinking to even happen in the first place. That's the basic idea behind I think, therefore I am. In order to think, there has to be some subject that is doing the thinking. And so my thinking is a definite and sure sign that I exist. And so it's my own existence that escapes skeptical doubt. That's the belief that we're going to start building back from. Wait, okay, that maybe makes a bit about it. But why couldn't the deceiving God is an omnipotent, all-powerful being? Why couldn't the deceiving God call that into doubt? Think of it like this. Let's say you have me. There I am, minding my own business, thinking about whatever I'm thinking about. Now, per the deceiving God hypothesis, God is floating around out there. And it's not just any old God. It's not a good God, right? It's a bad God. It's a deceiving God. And God, I'm thinking about whatever it is I'm thinking about. God's deceiving me, right? So he's shooting rays of deception from his finger right into my mind. And so I think that, the sky is blue and it's up there or whatever, but it's not actually. There's nothing up there and there's nothing blue, whatever, right? It's all deception. The idea, this is another way of getting at that idea that we were just talking about, that there's got to be some subject doing the thinking, right? We can think of it in terms of thinking, or we can think of it in terms of deception. So we just looked at it in terms of thinking. Now we're looking at it in terms of deception. So the idea, however, is going to be something like this. Imagine the deceiving God hypothesis were true. This is the way things are working then. There's me. I'm being deceived by this deceiving God, right? He's shooting these rays of deception at my mind. Okay, fine. But let's assume now that I don't exist. Get me out of there. Yeah? Let's say I'm not there. Well, then there would be no deception going on. There'd be no subject of that deception. And so God couldn't be deceiving anybody, right? God can only be deceiving if there is someone that he is deceiving. God can only deceive me if I am there to be deceived, right? In order for God to deceive, there has to be some subject that he is deceiving. And so even if there's a deceiving God, I still exist. Me, the subject of all that deception, still has to exist. Even if there's a deceiving God, he can't deceive me about my own existence. That's Descartes' idea. That's the cogito. Now, Descartes, one of the things you might notice in the paragraph we just read, he never actually says, I think, therefore I am. He says that somewhere else, but it's actually in French. And so he never actually says cogito ergo sum. Nonetheless, that's what he's famous for. He's famous for saying something like, I think, therefore I am, for saying cogito ergo sum, even though he never actually said that. When he published the Meditations, he also sent around to a bunch of other philosophers living at the time and asked for them to reply to it, for them to raise criticisms of it. These are called the objections. And then Descartes replied to those sets of criticisms. Those replies are called the replies. And so if you were to buy an edition of the Meditations, typically they would come, you'd get the Meditations plus the objections and replies. And the replies contain a lot of useful information for figuring out what exactly Descartes is up to in the Meditations. And so I'm including something like that here. Because one question you might have, cogito ergo sum, that looks like an argument. That looks like an inference. I think, therefore I am. Is that a kind of deduction, or are we going through this logical process where there are premises and a conclusion and so on? Descartes says, no, that's not what the cogito is. When someone says, I am thinking, therefore I am, or I exist, he does not deduce existence from thought by means of a syllogism, that is to say, by means of an argument. Rather, he recognizes it as something self-evident by a simple intuition of the mind. And so his idea here is that this basic idea that we're going to start building back up with is known by intuition. You just see it, just boom, got to be true all at once. It's not an argument that you work yourself through, right? Premise one, premise two, premise three, therefore the conclusion, right? Something like the function argument was an argument in that sense, where you looked at one premise, you understood it, you looked at a second premise, maybe you give an argument for it, you understand it, third premise, da, da, da. He's saying the cogito is not an argument like that. The cogito is something that you just see all at once, that you intuit and you see, I think, I exist all at once. Knowledge by intuition. Now, Descartes uses a variety of phrases for this, of this knowledge by intuition. And knowledge by intuition, that's what he uses there in the replies. That's not his typical terminology. The most typical terminology within the meditations is vivid and clear perception. That's the phrase he typically uses. Other translations call it clear and distinct perception. So you might hear that phrase if you hear somebody else talking about Descartes, but our translation calls it vivid and clear perception. To be clear, this kind of perception is not sense perception. Vivid and clear perception is something you do with your mind, right? You vividly and clearly perceive certain ideas with your mind. So with your mind, you can vividly and clearly perceive that you think, that you exist. You know it by intuition, right? Vivid and clear perception is the same thing as intuition. It's the same thing. They're synonyms for Descartes. Furthermore, both of those terms are synonymous with another kind of term that he uses, the natural light or the light of nature. So to vividly and clearly perceive something is the same thing as to intuit that thing, which is the same thing as to know that thing by the light of nature or by the natural light. And so when Descartes says, oh, I know by the natural light that blah, 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 he is saying, I vividly and clearly perceive that thing, or I intuit that thing. This is a bit of terminology that's going to be very important as we proceed and as we start seeing how Descartes attempts to fully build back up this system. One outstanding problem still at this point, right? So we have now one belief, one brick we can lay down as our foundation. I think, and I exist. Two bricks, if you want to call it that. How are we going to build back up anything else? How are we going to go even further? It seems like maybe we don't have enough bricks quite yet. But Descartes thinks just with what we have right now, we can start building back up the whole edifice of knowledge. And he's going to start doing this at the beginning of meditation 3. We're going to look at one last thing for meditation 2 in the next video, which it concerns Descartes' views about what he is. He has proved that he exists, and he's going to discuss very briefly what exactly this thing is, that he has proved exists. That's and he's going to return to this idea. He's going to say something very kind of brief about it in meditation 2, and then in meditation 6 he returns to it. So the last thing we're going to consider for meditation 2 is what he has to say about what this I is.